Today's keynote speaker is Galen Guengerich, who is from New York City, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior minister at UU All Souls in New York City. Thank you, Galen.
Thank you, Torah. Thank you, Elam. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I just want to begin by saying two things. One is that having listened and interacted yesterday, I'm aware that there's an awful lot of pain in this room. And I just want to acknowledge that. And in some measure, all of us are here because of that. But I also want to acknowledge that it is a spectacularly beautiful day today. As I was walking over here from my hotel, I was thinking, days don't get much better than this. And that's kind of life, a counterpoint of pain and promise. So today is ours to reflect on our pain, but also to reflect on the promise that lies within us and around us. I'm going to begin with a few lines from a sonnet by Theodore Withke, his sonnet titled In a Dark Time. I'm in the late stages of finishing a new book on contemporary spirituality, in which I argue in part that poetry is the scripture of contemporary spirituality. So if you hang around me very long, you will get some poetry one way or another. So this is Withke. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair. My shadow pinned against a sweating wall. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or winding path? The edge is what I have. Some years ago, my wife Holly Atkinson and I made an overnight trip to Lancaster County. Beginning in my mid-teens, I lived in the Lancaster area for a number of years and eventually went to college here at Franklin and Marshall. Holly and I were on our way to attend a retirement party for the Latin professor who had chaired the classics department during my time at FNL. En route, we meandered through lush Amish and Mennonite farms east of Lancaster, and we passed a small Mennonite church out in the country east of Strasbourg. One of my uncles had served that congregation for a time. I'd been a youth minister there for a few years and then acting pastor for a short time. As we passed the church, Holly noticed that I had grown quiet, then pensive. How do you feel about being here? She asked. After a long pause, I replied, I feel claustrophobic. On the other hand, this is the mine where my gold came from. My story is a tale of having grown up conservative Mennonite and then leaving the faith of my upbringing in search of a new home. I left in my mid-20s. It's the most difficult thing I have ever done. The Mennonite church, at least the conservative Mennonite church, is by design hard to leave because it was designed to be hard to break into. Like the Amish in many ways, the conservative Mennonites of my childhood in Greenwood, Delaware, followed a simple and relatively austere way of life. We drove cars but didn't have televisions. We dressed plainly and unfashionably. 2 decades behind the times, not a century or two behind the times like the Amish. We attended church 3 times a week, singing hymns without musical accompaniment. The use of instruments might lead to dancing, which was worldly and therefore sinful. Also, at least in that era, conservative conference Mennonites didn't vote or otherwise become politically involved. In the language of the tradition, we were called to be the quiet in the land. following the self-effacing example of Jesus in this life, even as we looked forward to extravagant rewards for our faithfulness in the next life. Over the centuries, Mennonites developed their intentionally inobtrusive way of life because they often encountered withering persecution for their faith, especially for their steadfast commitment to pacifism and the belief that members should be baptized only as assenting adults, not as passive infants. This practice of baptizing adults, known as Anabaptism, was a capital crime punishable by death in parts of Europe during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Mennonites defended themselves against persecution by developing close-knit communities within cloistered environments. They kept quiet and kept to themselves. In the Mennonite farming community where I grew up in central Delaware, virtually everyone was Mennonite, and many were related to me. My father is a Mennonite minister, along with 6 of my 10 uncles and 24 or so of my first cousins or their spouses. When people ask me what I do for a living, I sometimes say that I'm in the family business. Except that I'm not. I left the Mennonite church less for what it was than for what it was not. By the time I left, I had married a young Mennonite woman and had spent several years in seminary preparing to be a Mennonite minister. Why did I leave? It wasn't because I took issue with people who strive to live simply and peacefully. Even today, as I look at the many calamities in our world, I can confidently assert that the Mennonite way of life, at least at its best, isn't part of the problem. If everyone lived simply and peacefully, the world would be a far better place. Even so, my experience of growing up in the Mennonite cloister didn't leave me feeling safe from a physically and spiritually dangerous world. Rather, it left me feeling trapped in a world that, at least for me, wasn't the real world. The strategies the Mennonites had developed to survive persecution centuries before made no sense in a time and in a place where everyone was guaranteed religious freedom. I felt like I was living someone else's idea of a life, based on a tradition of belief whose time had passed. I wanted to be part of the world around me. By the time I was in middle school, my family had moved to South Arkansas, where my father started a Mennonite mission church. Though I attended public school, my parents tried to limit my exposure to the typical pursuits of teenagers at the time, watching television, listening to rock and roll, going to movies, and playing team sports, especially football. This was the South, after all. While I would eventually come to see the wisdom in some of my parents' limitations, I did not understand them at the time. I felt left out. Truth be told, there were other factors that contributed to my social isolation. As a teenager, I was substantially overweight, suffered from bad acne, sported a bad haircut, wore thick glasses, and typically dressed in hand-me-down clothes from older cousins. We were, after all, missionaries. If I'd been Southern Baptist, the dominant religion in South Arkansas at the time, or even Catholic, I might have felt the same way, but interpreted my feelings differently. Ironically, my most painful experiences of being left out came at times when I was the focus of attention. The girl who, most of the time in class, we were seated alphabetically. The girl who often sat behind me, her name started with H, was, by general consensus, the prettiest girl in our class. In my experience, at least, she was also the nastiest. She happened to be captain of the cheerleading team. Predictably, her boyfriend was the quarterback of the football team. She delighted in tormenting me by mocking my appearance to her friends, including her boyfriend, the quarterback, in sexually suggestive ways. I can still feel the humiliation. As I gained my independence during my late teens and early 20s, I was gradually able to reduce the ultimately superficial lifestyle differences between me and the non-Mennonites around me. Along the way, I became aware that these differences masked an underlying similarity in belief that we as Mennonites shared with many of the people around us, even the ones who lived differently. We as Mennonites were not alone in our loyalties. Like many who practice what I call the legacy religious traditions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Mennonites look to an ancient revelation as the source of our most trustworthy knowledge concerning what to believe and how to live. Scripture trumps science, and revelation trumps reason when it comes to deciding the most important things in life. Also, like many legacy traditions, Mennonites view this life mainly as a prelude to the next life, a foretaste of glory divine, as a popular Mennonite hymn puts it. On these terms, almost everything that has true meaning either happened in the ancient past or will happen in the infinite future. I left the Mennonite church because I didn't want to live with my eyes closed and my mind made up. I wanted to be open to whatever knowledge and experience might come my way in life. I also became increasingly clear to me that I couldn't serve two masters if I ended up in the ministry. The doctrinal commitments of the church on the one hand, belief in a supernatural God, divinely inspired scripture, the virgin birth, the resurrection, and so on, and the laws of nature as articulated by science and reason on the other. I couldn't preach one thing and believe another. But I also took personal issue with the view that, as the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans in the Christian New Testament, all things work together for good to them that love God. Sometimes that may be true, but sometimes it's not. In 1996, my niece Krista died after an 8-year battle with a pernicious brain tumor. It was diagnosed when she was 3 years old and she died at age 11. For nearly a decade, Krista's battle against the tumor defined our family life. Every year or so, we'd rendezvous for a week or more when Krista underwent yet another brain surgery. Initially at Children's Hospital in Little Rock, and then at the National Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C., when Krista's surgeon became head of surgery there. In the spring of 1996, my daughter Zoe and I went to my sister's home in the rugged hills of extreme western Maryland to visit Krista one last time. Zoe was almost 3 years old at the time, exactly the age Krista had been when the tumor was first discovered. The three of us played endless games of crackers in my bed. The game was simple enough for Zoe to understand, and the game pieces were large enough that Krista could still see them if she sat under a bright light. After we played for a while, Krista would ask to be taken for one of her twice daily naps, and Zoe would help push the wheelchair back to where a hospital bed had been set up in her bedroom. That's where Krista died several weeks later. A death that served no good purpose. Lucia Greenhouse, who with her husband and 4 children was part of my congregation for many years, tells about a similar crisis of faith in her memoir titled Father, Mother, God, My Journey Out of Christian Science. 7-year-old Lucia and her younger brother Sherman came home from school one day to find their sister Olivia lying on the love seat, her exposed skin covered with red spots. Olivia announced that she had chickenpox, which Lucia attempted to confirm with her mother, who shushed her. In Christian Science, her mother said gently, we know that there is no illness, no disease, no contagion. Olivia is not sick. She is God's perfect child. We are all going to work very hard to keep our thoughts elevated. A decade and a half later, when Lucia's mother fell ill with cancer, Lucia's faith reached the crisis point. Torah tells a similar story. growing up Amish, fleeing years of emotional and, in her case, sexual abuse. She says, "At age 15, I escaped in the middle of the night without telling anyone goodbye. I left with only what I could carry, the clothes on my back and $170 in my pocket." Mary Byler tells a similar story, as does Libby Hirschberger and many of you. Somewhat like Torah, when I left everything behind. My marriage, my extended family, my church community, as well as the vocation for which I had prepared. Ripping myself out of the fabric of my life was painful beyond words, both for me and for people I cared about, some of whom I hurt deeply. In the end, alone and on my own, I set out to find a way of life that was right for me. Did I have second thoughts? Of course. As Theodore Roethke suggests in his sonnet, it was a dark time for me. Roethke gets the internal battle exactly right. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? I felt there was a certain valor in my determination to chart my own course, but I found myself seriously at odds with the circumstances of my upbringing. Though I probably didn't know the purity of pure despair, as Roethke puts it, I did feel a deep sense of loss at all I was leaving behind. Many of my relatives thought my leaving was sheer madness, not to mention pure selfishness. They could never imagine doing what I was doing. Shortly after telling my extended family that I had decided to leave, I vividly recall opening my apartment door to find one of my older cousins, a Mennonite minister himself by then, and whose name you would probably know, who had flown across the country to try to talk me back from the precipice. As it turned out, he was only the first of many who would try to convince me to stay. But ultimately, I felt I had no choice but to leave. Initially, despite the losses I had incurred, I found the experience of being on my own exhilarating and also disorienting. Freedom, I came to learn, is the absence of something that holds us back, not the presence of something that lures us forward. As Janis Joplin sings, voicing Chris Christopherson's haunting refrain, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. For the first time in my life, I had no rules to follow, and no one would correct me if I went astray. I could do whatever I wanted during church times on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday evening. I could watch whatever I wanted, and even go to the movies. I could listen to whatever music I wanted, and even go dancing. Instead of living apart from the world, I became an active and engaged part of it. As I began charting my own course, however, I encountered a spiritual version of one dilemma of adolescence. By the time many young people leave home, they're happy to be gone from their parents' home. They are also often vehemently clear about the ways they don't want to be like their parents. The kind of neighborhood they don't want to live in, the kind of furniture they don't want to buy, the kind of food they don't want to eat. They soon learn, however, that the freedom to live anywhere you want doesn't mean you don't eventually have to choose one particular place to call home and furnish it with one particular assortment of furniture. After I left the religious world of my upbringing, I faced a spiritual version of this dilemma. I no longer had to follow my parents' way of life. I could do whatever I wished, but I couldn't do everything. I had to choose one particular way of life for myself, based on commitments I decided to make and goals I decided to pursue. Even though I was by then in my late 20s, I found myself wondering what kind of a person I wanted to become and how I wanted to live. In order to be truly free, I eventually discovered, I needed to belong once again. but this time to a way of life that I had chosen for myself, one that enabled me to find meaning and joy here and now. Several years ago, I visited Israel with an interfaith group of clergy from New York City. We spent some time with Natan Sharansky, the Russian mathematician and chess champion who became a human rights activist after the Soviets refused his application to emigrate to Israel. Some of you may recall the image of Sharansky in 1986 walking across the bridge in Berlin after 9 years in a Siberian prison. Now 70 and still a vital force in Israeli politics, Sharansky told us that the most profound realization of his life came to him in prison, and all of his experience since has substantiated this insight. People want two things, he said. They want to be free, and they want to belong. These are the two human passions, he said, freedom and identity. The discovery of your identity, he went on to say, gives you the strength to fight both for your own freedom and the freedom of others. His insight in prison was that identity comes first. Until you know who you are and where you belong, you can never be free. This is a counterintuitive claim. Most of the time we think of freedom in terms of absence. No obligations, no constraints, no commitments. We think of the open road and the solitary traveler of Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau. So in that spirit, let's say I invite each of you to come perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony for us, one at a time. Nothing is holding you back. You are completely free to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. But wait, you say, I need a cello and a decade of lessons, along with 100 other instrumentalists and 50 singers, not to mention a conductor and lots of rehearsal time. Until you are part of a symphony orchestra, you are in fact not free to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Until you find a place to belong, you can never be free. The same principle applies to sports. You aren't free to play a baseball game unless you belong to one of the teams. It also applies to politics. The collection of shared intentions and actions we call government is the prerequisite of our freedom as Americans, not the obstacle to it. Discovering where you belong is the first step toward being set free. On my journey from Mennonite to Manhattan, as I say, I learned that too much belonging can hold you captive, and too much freedom can leave you at loose ends. What we all need is a community where we discover who we are and find ourselves free to make the difference only we can make in the world. But the question is whether that community should be a religious community. In our culture, at least, religion has turned out to be a serious source of pain and trauma for many people. It's hierarchical, it's patriarchal, and it's typically fiercely resistant to change. And the problems begin at the top, with the traditional religious notion of God. The religions of the West, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are based on the belief that God exists above and beyond the realm of nature. They believe God commands and controls the forces of nature at will. These religions also maintain that God made rules and handed them down to humanity in the form of divine scripture, which directs believers to obey God's commandments. With this view of God, religion is mainly obedience dressed up in fancy clothes. But we've discovered that the universe isn't set up the way our ancestors originally thought. Half a millennium ago, Nicholas Copernicus looked into the night sky and discovered that the sun, not the earth, occupies the center of our solar system. In more recent times, scientists have made another discovery of similar magnitude. The fundamental laws of nature have existed from the very beginning. They apply everywhere at all times, and they do not change. The idea of a supernatural God, like the idea of an earth-centered universe, must be left behind. Some people today, including many leading scientists, trumpet this conclusion about the nature of God by arguing that religion doesn't need to change because it actually shouldn't exist. If God isn't supernatural, they say, then the idea of God and the role of religion are obsolete. This is sloppy logic. If Copernicus had followed a similar line of reasoning, he would have declared that if the earth is not the center of the universe, then the universe doesn't exist. We certainly need to rearrange the theological constellations, but this doesn't mean the sky is empty. Our challenge is to integrate what we have learned about God into what we know about religion. In fact, it's my view that our need for God and religion is made greater by these discoveries. If God is not supernatural and operating in a command and control universe, then religion has a critical role to play. Because religion is the process of taking everything we know into account as we forge a life of meaning and purpose. But in order to play this role, religion must adapt, and our understanding of God must adapt as well. In my view, religion is a way of life, not a random collection of trinkets and aphorisms that you pick up whenever you're feeling weary or wistful. You either take spirituality and religion seriously as a way of life, everywhere and all the time, or you don't. There are no half measures. The Mennonites of my upbringing were good as gold on being religious. They just fell seriously short when it came to being religious in the modern world. Faith, in my view, is not the belief in things that are impossible. It is rather a leap of moral imagination that imagines how the world might be transformed, how we might be better people and the world might be a better place. Religion is a way of life practiced by a community of faith in order to sustain faith and spark transformation. It's the cohesive collection of elements we use: songs, symbols, stories, rituals, obligations, sacred spaces, to maintain and renew our faith. The hard truth is that some religions, like some families, are better than others. Some religions are forged by intellectual coercion and maintained by steadfast denial, while others use rituals of shared experience to link the strength of what has gone before for the hope of what is yet to come. At their best, both families and religious communities create a sense of wholeness that is more than the sum of their parts. In either case, when they don't, then you should think about leaving. But if you do, you have to decide what's worth taking along and what's not. No family and no religious tradition is all bad. And no matter where you end up after you leave, whether alone or in another family, whether on your own spiritually or in another religious community, it's not going to be all good. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that when you leave, you get to take yourself with you. Your fabulous yet flawed self. Your broken self, yet your bursting with potential self. Your sinful yet destined for sainthood self. You've weathered the storm. You've made it through the dark night of the soul. You're a survivor. For you, someday, somehow, somewhere, there will be joy in the morning. Thank you.